ledger open on its high table, and I whispered a small, dangerous thing. We will write back. I had always thought that rebellions begin in silence. Not the silence of absence, but the kind that keeps its voice to itself, a low registering of a score, a ledger of small refusals written in margins and underlinings. It is a private mathematics, a hand that tucks a note into a binding, a step that avoids a street, a barter exchanged for a rumor. Lucy believed otherwise. She believed in heat, in voice, in motion. She believed that you could put a paper into a square and make an idea do the work of an army. She was young enough to imagine the square itself as a living page where every shout was a new sentence and every clap a punctuation. I watched her most afternoons as if from the other side of a glass, admiring, wary, counting how many more breaths a life could spend on an idea before it had to be paid for. She came to the bookshop high with plans and low on reasons. The sort of plans that come with names, a place, an hour, a barrel for a platform, a list that would be read aloud. She had taken to folding our counterfeits in ways that made them feel accidental, as if the ledger had simply misplaced a page. She spoke about the spectacle the way other girls might speak about a dress they wanted to wear on a Sunday, with an assumption of rightness rather than permission. If people see the name and hear that it can be moved, they'll ask why they had ever trusted it, she said, folding a stack of leaflets with the kind of speed that betrayed practice and fearlessness in equal measure. She put a single word at the top of some sheets we would distribute that day, choose. Her fingers stained with ink, she worked in the small universe of our counterfeits like an acolyte. Tyne worried in his slow, careful way. A reading is a million fingers pointing at you, he told her once, rubbing his thumbs together, as if he might rub prudence into his skin. He kept his voice low, not out of cowardice but because habit and survival had taught him the economy of speech. A press is secrecy disguised as noise. You make a thing public, and you make a thing legible to those who would read it against you. She listened to him for a minute, then smiled and continued cutting and folding. If we keep writing in the dark, we are only telling ourselves a story. If we put words where the city walks, we make other people see the sentence. She had what the city called courage and what I sometimes called folly. Between the two there is a seam where lives are pinned. I tried to negotiate with her. I tried to name the hazards as I would name a book's stains. Would the public be ready to accept a changed list? Would the thought of a page that could be altered survive the immediate convenience of the original ledger? Would the commissaire pay attention, and if he did, what kind of attention would he practice? She answered with the feverish exactness of someone who had already performed the scene in her head. They will be ready, she said. If they are not, they will become ready. If they are afraid, we will show them how to be unafraid. She sounded, I thought then and think now, like a preacher with a small, dangerous gospel. Madeleine offered softer weapons. She nodded and dropped a word here and a laugh there in her salon, where ladies traded silks and secrets in the same breath. Madeleine said the public could be nudged, that rumors were pliant things. A rumor shaped by fashion and fable might turn the square into a parable. Bastien promised to be the wind, leaflets on his hawker cart, an extra hand when the crowd wanted to move. Hortense sent a basket of washed linens and a nervous glance. Even Tien, for all his reservations, supplied plates and the knowledge of how a printed sheet would behave under sun and under the eye of a crowd. He made the counterfeits as if they were prayers, knocking down type so the words would sit right. He left each sheet smelling of ink and possibility. Antoine Valois arrived 3 days before the planned reading. He was young and practiced in the kind of rhetoric that tastes like metal. He had the posture of a man who knew how an audience is held, one small, precise gesture, a cadence of hesitated emphasis, and a smile that did not prove he felt what he said, but promised his listeners that he believed in them. Lucy glowed when he spoke, the way a lamp glows when set near kindling. We must show them their master is no longer certain. He told me in the cellar where I keep the cast-off bindings and torn proofs. Not with a death, not with a shout, but with a paper that contradicts an order. If a name can be moved, appointment is shown to be a choice. He rubbed his hands together as if warming them for winter. Show them the ledger is a machine, and then hide the machine. It was a neat phrase. Machines require parts. Machines can be taken apart. But a machine also requires witnesses, and once you make a machine visible, you invite a new kind of observer who is expert in dismantling rather than in admiration. I told him this. He smiled and said nothing, which is often what means yes. The morning of the reading was all small theatrics. Lucy woke before sun, humming to herself like a woman who has swallowed a tune she cannot yet hum aloud. She arranged the leaflets in protocols, some to be dropped at doors, some tied under bread, some to be sent through Bastien's stall. She tied a scrap of our counterfeit to the collar of a city actor, an elderly woman who looks like a widow and knows how to cuff on command. I watched them move like a small conspiracy of birds, each with a winged thing to carry. Tyne came in at dawn, rubbing his hands, his face a map of worry cut by lines of concentration. He had smuggled out a new set of plates, and had a look like a man who had just set a child into traffic but hoped it would learn to cross. The square smelled of the city, warm bread, horses' sweat, the oil and smoke of vendors. People sat in the sun to trade gossip and coin. A child ran barefoot, trailing a trailing ribbon dyed the color of some distant festival. The wine barrel, commandeered by a sympathetic coopersman, made Lucy taller than she was, and people turned because a voice in the market is always a part of the day's economy. She read without artifice, without the flourish of actors, and that was her cunning. She had the plainness of someone saying what everyone already suspected, but had not been given the name to say. We have been told names as if they were the weather, she said, her voice clear enough to catch and hold. A ledger says, thus and thus will be. We listen, we obey. But tomorrow is not the ledger's to claim. We may write. She turned a sheet so the words faced the crowd. Choose. The first sounds from the square were small, a cough, then the shuffle of a foot, then a woman who had been listening to her, washing repeat a phrase. It is always difficult to measure when a crowd begins to believe. It is like catching at smoke. Something in the air altered. People looked at one another, as if they were passing a private reading of a page they'd all read without permission. Some laughed with the relief of those who discover a play ends differently than they had been told. Some glared with the suspicion of those whose livelihoods are ordered by certainty. I felt, as any observer of crowds knows, the fragile thing that is belief tilt on its axis. For a moment the city seemed to hold its breath. Lucy read a contrived list that named, among the usual men, someone nobody expected, a cobbler with a limp who sold shoes to both sides, a child who ran errands, a clerk who kept 2 copies of marriage ledgers. We had chosen the names so they would produce surprise, and in that surprise a question, why these names? Why this order? If a name could be moved, how many other appointments were merely accidents of filing? People began to argue and laugh and threaten and cry. They began to conjecture the ledger's motives. A discussion opened like a wound, and then like a possibility. And then, because the world preserves its balance with a cruel precision, someone in the crowd made the calculation that makes police officers into theologians. They called for the commissaire. How that call was made I do not know. Rumor will explain it differently tomorrow than it did today. What I do know is that a ledger of certainty does not like being its own questioner. Certainty, to hold, requires rituals and audiences and the spectacle of punishment. The commissaire responds to doubt as a doctor to a fever. He puts a hand where something is burning. They arrived in permutations of authority, a clerk with a ledger faster than lightning, an inspector with a list of names pulled like a net. Men with municipal leather who could read the crowd's temperature and report it flat to the tribunal. They formed in an almost civil manner a cordon, and began to consult their papers. Lucy, who had no patience for those whose pens had titles but no courage, raised her chin. "We are showing a possibility," she said. "Your certainty has become a trap." The commissaire, who likes the sound of a name as others like the sound of a hymn, did not smile. He asked to see the list. Bastien, for reasons that would be explained later and now only rumor, tried to smuggle a packet of leaflets into the hands of a bystander. Men with ledgered hands saw the movement and moved to intercept. The square tuned its nerves to danger the way a violinist tunes to pitch. The arrest was not cinematic. There was no shout and no drawn sword. It was administrative. An officer read out a charge as if it were a citation from the law: public disorder, conspiracy to foment unrest, the dissemination of false lists. They lifted Lucy gently as if she were a sack of grain and placed a cord at her wrists. Her face was astonished in a way that made me ache. She did not plead. She did not beg. She looked at me as a woman looks at a ledger that names her and says, in that look, both accusation and apology. I moved before I had time to think. There are moments when the body decides faster than the mind. I reached the cord like a person reaching for a book she believes will keep someone from forgetting. "Take me," I said before I had measured the consequences of the phrase. It is a curious thing how certain words become shields. The commissaire glanced at me, and his ledgered mind considered the trade. He was in his way a man who liked exchanges. He looked at Lucy again, reading the way an accountant reads a balance, then at me, and made the calculation that would form the shape of the next day. But he chose procedure over poetry. "The law will take its course," he said. "You will both be brought in for questioning." It was their economy. Everything counted. Everything was accounted for. They bundled Lucy into a cart like a parcel and took her away. I stood in the sun, feeling at once naked and starved. The crowd dispersed in a rain of whispers and accusations. Some faces were glad, some were frightened. Others looked at me with the old merchant's expression that asks whether the thing you sell will bankrupt the neighborhood. We did not get her back that evening. She was taken to a wing of the tribunal where the walls smelled of chalk and old papers, and where men practiced the art of turning language into cudgel. The rumor of her capture moved faster than the cart. Madeleine, pale and quick, came to the shop and took my hand as if to weigh my pulse. Tian paced and cursed into his palms. Bastien hovered by the door like a stray dog that will not be shooed away. I felt acute and inexplicable, as if an enormous page had been ripped out of the city's book, and I was left to imagine both the whole and the burn marks at the edges. Father Binot came in the dusk with a lantern, and a sorrow he did not bother to hide. He sat at my table and said, in his low, steady voice, "There are prayers for those who act and prayers for those who talk. You have both in your shop, Mary." He folded his hands like a man closing a small book. "If you want her kept alive, you must consider not only what you say about her, but what you have already done. The tribunal is hungry for the names that produced this spectacle. There is a cruelty that lives inside interrogation rooms that is not about the noise of shouting. It is the stillness under which a man in an official jacket stamps a name and waits for the sound of its breaking." Lucy faced that quiet with a stubbornness that made me want to strike the tribunal myself. They offered small comforts, then cruel conveniences, a promise of leniency for truth. The correct chair, the correct question. They told her they could save her if she would tell them the names that organized the lists. She was young enough to be terrorized and brave enough to be deceitful. They worked the room like a surgeon batting at a vein. I sat in my shop and counted my hands. I thought of the ledger we had forged, of the names we had shifted like chessmen. I imagined the paper against Lucy's skin, the prints of fingers, the jobs that require secrecy and shame, and the small decisions that become prisons. I thought of the day that Tyne had burned a plate to spare a man he loved. I thought of the smallness of my own courage. I thought, with a clarity that was half grief and half calculation of the ledger that had started all this. A name, after all, is only a word until someone decides what to do with it. When the first rumor of a coursed confession reached us, I felt the shop tilt. It is a particular kind of horror to hear a thing you have taught repeated against you, to feel your hand shown in the work of another as evidence against you. Lucy had been fond of marginalia. She liked to press notes into the hollows of other people's books, as if to make a map for friends and fugitives. I had taught her to fold a list into a collar so the paper would warm against a throat. I had written in her hand once when her fingers shook that the tribunal would call these tender things tools of conspiracy was the sort of inversion that the world sometimes performs to its own advantage. At night I walk the shop and count the places where a page might hide false bottoms, hollowed bindings, the seam beneath the counter. I think of my ledgered life as a geography of concealment. Lucy had walked those places with the airy step of someone who believes a plan will hold. I had believed it, or I had pretended to, and in that pretense had given permission. That is the other arithmetic of complicity, not only what you do but what you allow yourself by not saying no. The city tightens when it smells fear. It draws its lines like a hand around a throat. I do not know, as I write this in the small hours, whether her words were broken or offered as a sop to stop the pressing. There are reports that say the tribunal coaxed names from her with promises of mercy. Others say she spoke to protect those she loved. In the quiet between rumor and truth, I feel my own pulse as proof that a body is the first ledger, keeping record of where it has been hurt. They have taken her to the rooms where men consult the calendar of the guillotine, as if it were a weather chart. A name placed on a day is as much a forecast as a decree. Lucy's arrest has tightened the mechanism the ledger maintains. It has also, in some strange arithmetic, pushed doubt into the open. People ask now whether a name is a sentence or a choice. They debate in the markets about which manuscript is true and who profits by certainty. The trade-off is cruel. A captured voice teaches others caution. But it also lights the corner of a dark street so that more eyes can see the shape of the thing they had been told to accept without question. I set a chair by the window and wait. The day our little religion of margins had to answer for itself, I thought there would be a thunderclap, a clear dividing line. Instead there are 1,000 small trimmers, an altered glance, a coin left at the counter with a folded list inside. Bastien's reluctant smile when he slips a packet into a standing customer's hand. These are the small rebellions that make the coffee of a revolution palatable. Lucy is a martyr only insofar as being young is the world's indictment. She is also our teacher. She taught us that voice moves a body, and that bodies in motion carry contagion. I watch and catalogue as if my trades were duties and my duty were to memory. I will go to the tribunal. I will stand and speak and keep my ledgered voice steady. There are things one can say that destroy a plan and things one can say that salvage a life. I have been careful all my life about the way I pick words, about the way I let syllables fall into a customer's lap. Yet I have found in the suddenness of this crisis that care can be a form of cowardice if it keeps us from acting when the small life in our hands is threatened. Lucy's fingers had a tendency to leave their print on everything. There was a smudge of ink on the edge of a sheet that she pressed into the collar of a runaway's jacket, and later I found the jacket folded on a chair. This morning there was a scrap of paper stuck to the inner hem of her sleeve, as if when they took her they had not had the precision to prize every secret away. I keep that scrap now like a reliquary. On it is a single scratched word, a child's name perhaps, or a joke. I do not yet know its meaning. I fold it into the ledger beneath my pillow and count breaths. The night before Lucy was taken she wrote in a book she keeps under the counter. The entry was short and fierce. I will not be polite to a ledger. I will not be polite to the men who name us. I will be loud enough for the ones who have no voice. Reading it, I felt the pure, terrible force of youth, a hunger to be seen, to be known, to effect change before the world takes the opportunity away. What that hunger costs is a question I will be answering for the rest of my life. When the tribunal wants names, it wants them clean and enumerated. It wants the world to be a ledger with columns and amendable balance. We have, for years, traded in margins. We have taught people how to read between lines, how to tuck a message into the grain of a binding, how to turn a list into a lie. Now one of our students sits on a bench of a prison and the lesson is being taken as evidence. It is the paradox of the work. Secrecy helps the brave live. Exposure makes the brave icons. I have never wanted to make an icon of Lucy. I wanted her to learn the careful arts of survival. She learned instead a lesson of motion. She will be questioned again tomorrow. The faces that ask questions will be trained to look for trimmers. Their ears will be trained to catch the tremble of a conscience. I will be there. Tyne will be there in a way that looks like solidarity and feels like terror. Father Binot will show his ink-stained cuff as if to say he knows the value of a page. We will all give accounts for what we have done and for what we have failed to do. The ledger will be in the room. This city is good at making its tools into juries. There is a moment always when a plan that once seemed brilliant curdles into something else. The square has taught me that lesson with many faces. Lucy's fire lit something visible and dangerous and necessary. The question that keeps me awake is not whether she was wrong to act, but whether I was wrong to let her be my pupil. It is the unanswerable arithmetic of guardianship, when to restrain and when to release, when to act and when to trust another's courage. The cost of both choices is a human life. I am writing now to pin the event down, to make it a record against time. Names move like currency. They are continually devalued and reissued. Lucy's arrest has turned our small bank of names into a precarious capital. Tomorrow will be a reckoning. Tonight I fold her scrap of paper, smooth its creases, and tuck it into the book beneath my pillow. I count the places where a page might hide and the ways a ledger might be read differently. A public reading was her choice. Her capture was the consequence, and now consequence has a new name and a new arithmetic. The hook is not an end but a hinge. Lucy, who burned with the reckless faith of youth, is now a hinge. What moves on her turning will decide some of us. The tribunal will ask questions and hope for answers that make a map of our little rebellion. I will answer as best as a woman can who knows how to weigh words. But I also hold, in the pocket of my apron, a folded smear of manuscript that suggests nothing is inevitable. If a name can be moved in a crowd, it can be moved again. The blade of certainty glitters, but so do our margins. Tomorrow we will see which shines truer, and whether a girl's voice can change the ledger's hand. They brought her in on a morning that smelled of laundries and rain, when the gutters ran thick and the market had not yet learned whether the day would be one of bread or lament. I was at the counter, measuring time in the slant of light that came through the high window and in the small, inexorable rituals slipping a bookmark between a spine, repairing a hinge with a scrap of linen, tasting the dust of old paper under my tongue like an oath. The shop is a place of accumulation, of margins, of excuses, of bindings that close like shutters against the world. It is also a machine that counts absence. Each book that leaves is a little geography of loss. I had not known until that day that absence could be called back by a single name. They came with no claimer, but with a firmness that is worse than claimer. Jean Morel's boots made their even, reluctant sound in the lane. He stood outside the door for a full minute, looking not at me, but at the sky as if appealing to a ledger there. When he stepped in, he avoided my eyes, but he carried a kindness folded into his motions and officer's small defiance. "Madame la Maire," he said, and I read in the tightness of lips an apology before any words. "I'm sorry. There's been movement at the tribunal." He could not say more. There are things a man in uniform cannot say without bringing the world down. It was Lucy who was the movement. When they pushed the door open, she walked with them between her captors as someone walks a known rote. Her chin rose and fell as if she were reciting a catechism. She had the look of someone who had expected to be taken. As children expect punishment, it is the surprise that a decent person cannot understand. Her hair was glued to her forehead, the smudge at her temple a brown bruise that read like a printer's stain. She would not look at me until the end, when our eyes met for half a breath, and she held my gaze the way one holds a lantern to examine a map, intent, hopeful, imploring. There are a dozen ways to arrest a person. The tribunal's method is the arithmetic of humiliation. Take the prisoner from the street and lay them before a bench, sit them under a lamp, and ask them to recount the ledger of their days until their confessions join the official record. It is not merely the pain of hands or cords. It is the slow accounting, the imperative to list. Name the others, they ask, and the mouth becomes a register and the teeth, pliers. They took her to a chamber whose window had been nailed shut. The lamp burned so low that it seemed to draw answers into itself. Clerk with a neat, cruel nose and a quill that scraped the table like a small harrow sat opposite. A man I did not know. He had the kind of face that remembered rotes more than kindness kept the door. The questions began with the slender instruments of paper and ink. Who carried this list? Who set ink to type? Who pressed a plate into the press? Later they would put to her a harder thing, dates, meetings, the names she had read aloud to crowds. They called it evidence. To me it would look like a ledger being replenished. When I learned of her detention, I went straight to Father Beno T. That is what one does when the law has turned its face to iron. One seeks out what remains of the human. The chapel smelled of boiled herbs and wax, the crack of candlelight making the thin, palimpsested walls tremble like a throat. Father Beno T. sat beneath a fresco of a saint whose halo had been cracked in a recent skirmish of paint and rain. He had always been a man who kept his hands busy, in one a stack of prayer beads. In the other, a scrap of paper where he had written down names of those who had sought sanctuary. She is young, he said without looking at me, and it is the small, particular facts that a priest notices. She may speak when she hears herself named in the ledger. We must consider what answers to give to a city that prefers certainty. We moved between the corridor of the tribunal and the chapel in a rhythm I did not know I had left behind. Lucy was questioned in a way that was more embroidery than butchery. The interrogator would insinuate a fact and watch her face for the stitch. He told her, softly, that her letters and lists had been found and that if she wished, she might save her mother from the market's rumor. He promised reprieve in exchange for names. These promises are the old bargains of an administrative state. You sell a name to save a life, and the ledger takes both in repayment. She confessed first to the small things addresses, the time she met Bastien at the cafe, the place where Tyne kept his plates. Each disclosure is not merely a piece of information but a tiny detonator. A name is a fulcrum. Meanwhile, the administrative machine leans upon it and produces consequence. When she said the name of a man who sold ribbons on Rue des Tisserands, they nodded as if the sound were holy. They took down his profession, his wife's name, which child had a cough. The clerk's quill dutifully moved as if writing the city's fate in alphabetical order. It is a particular kind of grief to hear a child of your keeping enumerate the steps you took to build a harbor for them. I thought I was giving her courage, I told Father Beno T. later, and he turned a bead around his fingers as if measuring my confession like a rosary. Courage is not responsibility, he said, but to be a shelter is to carry the weight of what is brought through your door. I have a habit of cataloguing the small betrayals a person makes before anything larger falls. In the days after Lucy's arrest, I could remember how she had folded a list into her sleeve with a trembling thumb. The way she hummed while she sorted the margins as if the act were a lullaby. In her cell she sang no songs. She said what she thought they wanted to hear because they had taken her body and we're exacting payment. But there are different modes of naming. Some names land whole and hard,